Välkomna allihopa. Vi har startat vår internationellt modersmålspoesikafé. Det är mångspråkig poesiplattform för poeter från olika länder och olika språk. Och denna gång har vi gäst från Wales, Dominic Williams. Han är poet, översättare, redaktör och lärare på skrivarlinje på Wales universitet. Och han också introducerat många populära poesiaktiviteter, både Wales och andra länder, även i Sverige. Och välkommen Dominic Williams. Jag flyttar till engelska. We have begun our International Mother Language Poetry Café, och varje gång vi har gäster från olika länder, olika different countries and different languages. Today we have a guest. He's a poet, editor, and teacher of creative writing at different universities, and he also introduced a number of popular poetry activities and festivals. We are very happy to get Dominic Williams, our guest from Wales. Welcome, Dominic.
Thank you, Alison.
It is a good chance it is a good chance for us to come in touch with you and Wales traditional poetry. And today we'll have some questions to you. The first question will be, how would you define Wales poetry?
Okay, well, Welsh is one of the oldest living languages in Europe. The Welsh language could be up to 4,000 years old. So it has a long history as a spoken language before it was ever a written language. And I think that's probably indicative of poetry in Wales. Poetry, I believe, is of the language arts, the discipline that has the closest relationship with the oral tradition. With storytelling, with songs. And I think that's in the Welsh psyche. Wales is officially a bilingual nation. We're a population of 3 million, and I would say 3 million are English speakers. So there's an English language tradition and a Welsh language tradition of poetry in Wales, but they're both alive and very loud. Very loud. I think that's, again, part of the history of poetry in Wales, is that the idea of the spoken word. The Welsh language tradition is supported greatly by the Eisteddfodau, which are festivals of competition of the language arts in Wales, particularly in the Welsh language. But certainly of late, English language poetry also is becoming far more of a very popular spoken word tradition, and spoken word events are prolific in both languages right now.
Thank you. The next one is, I myself know very popular international poet, Dylan Thomas is an Welsh poet, but in the academia, in the international context and the post-colonial British countries, Dylan Thomas is presented as a British or English poet. Would you like to comment on it?
Well, I think poetry and many cultural artistic outputs are inherently political, whether they intend to be so or not. Not necessarily writing political poetry, but there will be an element. Dylan Thomas was a product of a post-colonial nation. He grew up between 1914 1953, his life. It was a time of great British nationalism, I guess, because we were experiencing the Second World War. Wales is possibly one of the earliest colonies of the British Empire. The Act of Union was 1536, and the Welsh language has been greatly oppressed by the colonizers since that time. It was only 1967 that the Welsh language was finally recognized as an official state language in Wales. So Dylan Thomas grew up in a generation where the Welsh language was something of an embarrassment, perhaps, to his parents. His mother certainly came from a very strong Welsh-speaking rural background. But as aspiring middle-class people, they were pushing their Welsh culture a little bit to the background. The language of progression was perceived to be English, and so Thomas wrote in English. Great hints of the Welsh language tradition in his writing, actually. But as a young man, you know, he wanted to get to London. He wanted to move to the centre of Britain and the centre of England. In terms of whether he is presented or perceived as a British or English poet, is slightly different. Certainly he was an English language poet, and Wales is a bilingual nation. There's a huge tradition of Welsh writing in English. But the international perception of him, perhaps as British or English, is simply an ignorance of the existence of Wales and of Welsh culture.
Yeah, I got it. And I would like to have another supplementary question here, because both you and I have a colonial legacy, as you mentioned, referring Wales. And from the post-colonial countries, or having colonized pain in our feeling, our literary tradition usually have a very strong part complaining the colonial emergence. Would you like to tell about the Wales feeling against the colonial emergence?
Okay, I mean, it is. I've mentioned Wales as one of the earliest colonialized nations. It is a matter for debate, certainly within Wales, as to whether it ever was colonized or whether it was a symbiotic relationship, an empathy. But there are elements of that absolutely permeate Welsh poetry. And maybe I could take this opportunity to read a poem that I was hoping to read in a little while. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my poetic contemporaries, and one of those is Sean Owen. Sean is a fantastic writer in both English and Welsh. He's a TV presenter, he's a musician, he's an accomplished artist. But allow me to read you one of his poems then. Okay, welcome. So this is very recently published, about 2 years ago, in Sean's collection Cawl. Cawl is a Welsh word for soup, a stew, something that's a huge mix of lots and lots of vegetables and things. And this volume is a mix of Sean's work. But I'd like to read this poem called The Oxymoron. You are now entering the post-industrial, regenerated South Wales valleys, reversing up through the one-way out that ebbs trudging commuters like silt down a bottleneck, wedged between two gouged fern-compensated hills, rotting green and orange like week-old pumpkins, to the hub of activity and investment of a city growing in numbers, swept up in a mulching heap, like leaves under the feet of those who flee. The branches of this dying tree, whose bark is worse than its bite marks, held at arm's length from the inadvertent hand that feeds us, which once took as we continue to give, which now takes as we continue to live. Picking at the scab of an industry, we are amputated and encouraged to be indebted to the prosthetic attitude of the voice at the end of the line.
Thank you.
I'll allow Sean's poetry to answer that question, Alistair.
Okay, good. And I would like to get back to Dylan Thomas again. And how would you find Dylan Thomas today in Welsh poetry as well as in the international tradition of poetry, both as a poet, reader, and also a practitioner in teaching poetry?
Okay, I mean, Dylan Thomas is quite clearly an international poet, or a poet of international renown. He features very importantly in the Welsh canon of English writing in Welsh. He is taught in education systems, both at secondary school and at third education level. It's unlikely that a Welsh language poet would have the same international renown. It's quite obvious there aren't as many Welsh speakers in the rest of the world. So it's a slightly odd question, a slightly odd thing to consider when people from the same cultural roots are writing in two different languages. There are other Thomases. There are many other Thomases in the Welsh literary tradition, within the English language literary tradition. I think particularly of R.S. Thomas and the war poets Edward and Alan Thomas, First World War and Second World War poets. I think a prophet in his own country may describe Dylan Thomas in one sense. He is greatly loved and greatly loathed in equal measures in Wales, and he is influential for sure for writers all over the world in the English language, in Wales too right now, but he is not the figure in Wales, perhaps, I believe, that he is internationally.
All right. What is the state of poetry in post-Dylan Thomas Wales?
I think the state of poetry in Wales is very, very healthy. As I say, you know, it's particularly at this time, it's alive in the spoken word. I think that's one of the most important things. I keep coming back to that. I believe poetry should be heard. It should be read aloud. I believe it has been confined to the page for, I don't know, maybe 800 or 900 years. It's just a moment really in this great tradition. It belongs in voice. It should be voiced, and that's definitely what is happening in Wales at the moment, both in the Welsh language and in the
Hello.
statements. It's the poetry of activism, and I think particularly in the Welsh context, or maybe in the Celtic context, again, because of this long oral tradition, poetry is quite democratized in Wales. It doesn't suffer the same elitism that it might do in other languages or in other nations. It's quite commonplace. It's accessible, and I think that's the power of its survival.
And what is the difference between spoken word poetry and the traditional poetry?
It depends how far back you believe traditional poetry existed. I mean, many of the established forms that we describe as being part of traditional poetry, I'm fairly certain originated as memory techniques from people who were practicing the oral tradition. The idea of repetition, either of lines or of words, yeah, the poetic techniques such as alliteration, many of these things are sound-based. Of course they are. Poetry is about creating a soundscape that will evoke an emotion. So I don't think there is a significant difference between spoken word or poetry that was confined to the page for a couple of hundred years. It's an evolution of the art form.
Let me get back to your own poetry, and I would like to ask you, why do you write poetry?
I think I write poetry primarily to communicate. I think like many writers in many different disciplines, sometimes we have problems with communication, and we have to very carefully choose our channels through which we feel comfortable. So I think communicating is largely the driver for my writing of poetry, communicating my emotions, and that's what, again, it's a subjective point of view, but I believe is the greatest power of poetry is not to convey necessarily a meaning. If a reader or a listener doesn't interpret the same meaning as that intended by the poet, that's not important always. What I think is important is that the reader or listener experiences the same emotion that the poet was trying to communicate.
All right. The question, next one, sounds provocative, but it is not the purpose to provoke you. Why readers will read your poetry?
I think a reader should read my poetry. They should read any poetry for what they may be able to take from it. Once we have written our poems, they don't belong to us any longer. Once we finish them and publish them or read them, then they belong to the reader or the listener, and they take from it whatever they will. And if somebody comes to me and tells me that they've read something in my poem that was nothing to do with what I had intended, then it is absolutely valid. It is absolutely true. That is their truth. That is what that poem is all about for them, and it's what that poem is all about in its existence. It's a piece of art. Any poem is a piece of art, and it belongs to the person who beholds that art. And that, of course, changes in spoken word. When you read a poem to an audience, the environment in which you read it will be different every time. The audience will be different every time. And so that poem becomes different every time. And it belongs essentially to the receiver, to the listener or the reader.
Great. What is your ongoing writing project now?
We have a couple of ongoing projects. I mean, as you know, I facilitate a lot of literature and art as well as my own work. During this period, Rightful Words, the organisation I work with, are very much like Litteracentrum Uppsala, converting a lot of our projects, our ongoing projects, to digital channels. And while we're in lockdown, using this sort of medium, so we're organising regular spoken word events, poetry readings that have become far more international than they ordinarily would have done because of the access of this medium. They become accessible to disabled writers as well, which is something that we're really pleased about. Many writers who wouldn't have been able to come to our physical events are finding it far easier to participate in our online events. I'm also working on a project that you're aware of, Alicia. We're working together on a project about Bengali Welsh cultural identity. And I'm probably avoiding talking so much about my own writing because I'm one of those creative people who is struggling to express their creativity during the lockdown period. So I guess I'm trying to write some lockdown poems. I'm trying to document my experience in this time. And perhaps I'll visit one of those later.
All right. The next one is, how do you define the internationalization of literature, since you are talking about international involvement, and also you are working with a good number of international writers from different cultures and countries. How would you define the internationalization of literature?
I think internationalization is about sharing. It's of course about learning about different cultures, learning through art forms, about different experiences, but it's also about finding shared experience as well. I think perhaps one of the best examples of the international work that I'm involved with is the residencies, the international writers residencies that are hosted by Cultivera in Troyes, and those have been running annually since 2014. You were a participant in the 2014 residency, Anastasia, yeah. And it's interesting to just allow space. I think that's really important, to allow creative people just space to interact with each other, and not to be prescriptive about what the outcomes may be, not to look for translations necessary, or to seek collaboration, or to require specific writing, but just allow creative people to be, and they will share their cultural differences within their creative practice, as well as within their social experience. And we will, in those meetings, celebrate both the diversity and the common experience, and that will develop the writing that comes from that experience, from those writers. The wider we're able to share, the wider we're able to experience other writing, will always improve our own writing.
What is your next project of writing?
I'm hoping I'm doing a few projects in translation at the moment. I'm working with other writers, mostly editing pieces that have been either self-translated or have been translated by a non-native English speaker. So those are occupying my time mostly in the short term. I would like to produce another collection. So if I can start some lockdown writing, then we'll see where that goes.
Good luck. Then would you like to read some of your poems and some other Welsh poetry?
Thank you. Yes, I would.
Yeah, welcome.
Maybe you can edit this point, Alicia. I don't know. I'll come back, because I'm wondering whether we're going to lose the connection for the meeting. Do you think halfway through?
How many minutes? Did you count time? I can see.
I've not been counting, but I know it feels like we've been talking for.
Let's continue. If it is disrupted, then I'll send you the link. Then we have the possibility to edit. Okay. No worry.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anastasia. I'm not going to read any Dylan Thomas today, but perhaps I will start by reading a poem that was inspired very much by his work, by his probably most famous villanelle, "Do Not Go Gentle." It's a poem. The "Do Not Go Gentle" was a poem that Dylan Thomas wrote for his father on his deathbed, because he was urging his father not to let go. And it was 2014, about 7 years after my own father had died. while I was in Tronos with Anasir, that I finally wrote a poem for my mother about my father on his deathbed. It's different to Thomas because sometimes in life and in death, we make the decision that it is time to leave. So this is called Went Gently, and it opens with 2 lines from Dylan Thomas. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. The sailor with a head full of fire, dancing on Mumble's pier and scaling heights. So fragile now, man of stick in linen. I tease you, want to make you mad, want to see you double up with foolish hoots. But you are raging, and I do not know. Raging, raging like a red dwarf. Oh, my father, you have given me the hardest task. To stop a blazing, a blessing is required. I have to tell my mother to let you go. And so, an Indian summer's kiss gently opens your eyes for a last smile as you pass to me a duty to protect your wife. And she now, living fire, burns, burns like flaming June. Okay. This poem is about a spoken word event actually. I'm the MC of several spoken word events. And this poem is about that experience. It's about standing on the stage, waiting for the audience to arrive, waiting for the participants to arrive, and then hosting an event. There are a couple of Welsh references. Y Hen Gogledd is Welsh for the Old North, which is that part of the United Kingdom, that part of England around about Liverpool, that was once part of the land that was occupied by the Celts. So it's referred to as the Old North of Wales. It refers to 2 Welsh poets, Taliesin and Aneurin, who were writing in the 6th century or composing poetry in the 6th century in Welsh, very much at the heart of the Welsh spoken word oral tradition for just over 1,500 years. And Maes y Show is the showground in Welsh. Virginities. He watched as they arrived, like cousins he remembered playing with as a child. They took their early seats and waited for the wedding guests to begin. The gilded groom choreographed the waltzers, and then the Virgin began to twirl. She brought him a blue-eyed warrior from Y Hen Gogledd, the land of Taliesin and Aneurin. She brought him to the old capital of the north and returned him along the narrow cosmopolitan veins of the south. Just above this line, an Irish tigress roared from the corner of her eye. Another gave him the perfection of solitude. The fairground flirting is the fear of the fling, a raffle prize. He led her also to Maes y Show. And as she passed into the shrouding mist, he thought that she would not that night leap the pebbled wind, as she promised to dream of him scribbling. But he would scratch with claws that will grow to quill length.
Thank you.
And I'll read one more of mine. Sorry, I had the page marked. This is not an autobiographical poem. This is the madman on the train. I am the madman on the train, the one who drinks special brew from the can and offers to share his last drop with you and wants to hold your hand, tells you how his wife saved his life and the history of his land, urging you to press your mobile phone against the carriage window at crucial moments to document its magnificence. Who told you that beauty will save the world and that it will start with loving someone. Who asked when you had been and how you'd lived and why we were all going. Who for 15 minutes was your strangest friend and bared his soul, and in doing so allowed your view to clean away the shadows of the demons who, fed by fear, oppressed him all the office long. I am the madman on the train. And if you hear me singing to myself in the supermarket, then hug me and be freed. Okay, I'd like to introduce you to another of the Thomases I mentioned, Anastasia. This is R.S. Thomas. I think probably my favorite among the writers of Welsh poetry in English, named Thomas. This is Circles. The astronauts could not conceal their triumph as the last star drifted away on the port bow. Limitless space took them to itself. Weightlessness possessed them. No hunger anymore, no desire for liquid. Immortality was within their grasp as an ability to travel onward forever. After how many days, years, their instruments were alerted. A forgotten gravity began drawing them down to where they had set forth. With a bleak gleam, the knowledge broke on them that infinity also was drowned. On a pitiless runway, no wives, children awaited their return. Only the old senators, statesmen were lined up in their funeral clothing, ready as ever to declare war. Another contemporary of mine is Owen Shears, and Owen Shears, Sean Owen, R.S. Thomas, all very, very influential in my work. This is Owen Shears, A True Story. You have the truth tattooed on your back. At least that's what you told me it meant. A single Japanese symbol in blue-green ink, high on your shoulder blade, a spider pretending to be dead. Sometimes it looks like a mistake, part hidden by the strap of your dress. Does that make it a half-truth? A white lie on your shoulder, ready to whisper into your ear. Once when we had argued and you had played dumb all day, you turned your back to me in bed, forcing me to face the truth in a language I will never understand. One of the greatest writers, one of the greatest living writers in the Welsh language is Menna Elfyn. Menna Elfyn is probably the most translated of all Welsh language poets all over the world into many, many languages. Menna writes almost exclusively in the Welsh language, and she doesn't translate her own poetry. It's translated by a cohort of wonderful translators who translate her into English. But just a month or so ago, she did send me a poem that she'd written in English. It was at the start of lockdown. So here's a very early lockdown poem from Menna Elfyn. It's called No Palm Sunday 2020. It's just been announced Palm Sunday will remain calm this year. No straining over graves, the annual visit, turfing the grim smiles of weeds who have, after all, been more than loyal companions. no rickety or steely vases, no cellophane posies, hastily removed on arrival, bought from garage forefronts. No use singing this year. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Passing? They've passed. And every Easter we pass along the hills to Cwmpengraig, Head Valley, Rock of a Field, we lay flowers on the family grave. Grandparents staying put in their bro. We laugh, remembering our parents' chaff as they punish us, join forces there one day, all in one, out of place, in place. So we'd suffer the jolty drive on the narrow lane once a year. But today, the joke's on us, as they chose the creme à la creme. Amen. So we'll miss the obligatory visit this year. Necessary journeys do not include the long gone dead. No seal of Blodau, a Sunday Welsh with flowers, more to their liking than a palm. And so we'll not give the quiet bunch even a leaf, or the recluse of an aunt who left her fortune to the missionaries somewhere far away. For years we cursed her, until truth be told that the cat's charity got her cash, though not a whisker did she possess. Still, my father, the minister, as ever, insisted charity was in order and we should grace her always with petals. No daffodils, mind you. My aunt or parish will plonk, their resting place detected from a hedge nearby. For my mamgie and dadkie then, in fair weather days, gladioli were the chosen ones, since they looked a cut above the rest, magnanimous, real show-offs. As for this year, Palm Sunday will indeed be calm. A silence instilled, a day to behold, no tripping over gravestones, spirit level askew from the storms, no small talk, chatter, no fellow shudderers who'd bewail the state of the graveyard. What is the world coming to, they'd say, and we'd nod, agree, sigh, and sashay, knowing full well what the world is coming, and coming for us.
Thank you. Would you like to read more?
I'll finish with one then, Anasir. This is a walk on the beach a couple of days ago. I am trying to write a triptych of poems about lockdown called Our Mother Earth is a Tough Old Bitch. And this is one short one then. Our Mother Earth is a tough old bitch. What do we learn from this scene? As swifts and swallows fill Carmarthenshire skies, uninvited touring visitors. Jellyfish cover our sands with their final resting. We accept this life, we accept this death, as welcome signs of the arrival of a season of lightness, as another of nature's smallest organisms tries to teach us to desocialize. Humankind's technology could not save our lives, but it saved our souls.
Thank you. Very good ending.
Thank you, Anasir.
We love to listen to you any other occasions soon, either online or physically. So we will be looking forward to welcome you here.
Thank you very much.